So far, we have been following Aquinas' first proof of the existence of God. Having started with an immediate understanding that there are things that are moved, and having seen that what is moved by another, we can now ask if the mover that moves the moved is itself moved. If it is moved, is it then moved by a second mover, that is in turn moved by a third mover? What about this third mover? Is it itself moved by a fourth mover? How far can we go in this series of movers that are moved, or to use a different phrase, these moved movers? Aquinas' response involves a second metaphysical principle. Movement cannot be explained simply with a series of moved movers. Or put in other words, one cannot regress to infinity in moved movers. To understand why this is important, we have to go back to what Aquinas is trying to explain. For example, let us say that a metal horseshoe, horseshoe A, is moved from being potentially hot to being actually hot by a mover that is another horseshoe, horseshoe B, which is itself actually hot. In this case, we have something moved, horseshoe A, by something else, which is a mover, horseshoe B. But what if horseshoe B itself was moved from being potentially hot to being actually hot by another mover that is itself also actually hot, say horseshoe C? In this case, horseshoe B would itself be moved, and for this reason we say that it is a moved mover. We can go even further. What if horseshoe C itself is moved by another, etc., etc.? Let's look at this in a more generalized way. Aquinas begins with something evident to us, namely something is moved. This means that there is a subject that passes from being potentially in some way to being actually in some way. What explains the fact that there are things that are moved? What is the cause of movement? We saw in the previous section that this is explained by something else that is a mover that moves the subject from being in potency to being in act. Also, in order to do so, this mover must actually have the perfection that it communicates. But what if this mover is itself moved from a previous potentiality? We would then have to find the cause of this mover's being moved. Now, since everything that is moved by another, we find that this moved mover is itself moved by another mover. But what about this second mover? What if the second mover is itself moved? Since it must be moved by another, we have a third mover. And so now we have a series of moved movers. How many moved movers do we need to explain movement? 20, 30, a million? An infinite number? At this point, we start to realize that even if the number of moved movers were a very large number, or even if it were an infinite series of them, they would still not fully explain why there is movement. All that we have at this point is that something is moved by a mover, and that this mover is itself moved by a mover, which in turn is itself moved by yet another mover, and so on. But if each mover is itself moved, the explanation or cause of movement always points back to another mover that moves, and that to another, and so on. In the end, we can get an explanation of the cause of movement of each individual thing, but we do not ever get to the cause of movement itself. An example that is often given is that of train cars. If we look at any one particular car, we understand that it moves forward because it is moved by a different car. This second car is moving because it is pulled by a third, etc. If we go forward a number of cars, we still have a car that is in turn moved by another car. How many cars or moved movers do we need to explain the movement of the cars? 100? 1,000,000? An infinite number? But even if this series of moved movers continued indefinitely in an unending series, we would still not have a full sufficient explanation of movement. What then is the explanation or cause of movement? At this point of the argument, we do not yet have an answer. What we do know, however, is that if something is moved, it is moved by another. Furthermore, if this mover is itself moved by another, and that is, in turn, moved by another, and so on, this series still does not give a complete explanation of why there is movement. Aquinas expresses this by saying that the series of unmoved movers cannot go to infinity, implying that if all there is are only moved movers, there would be no movement at all, since there would be no sufficient explanation or cause for the movement to begin with.